You've seen the title. What is the worst thing about every single Fire Emblem game? It can be something major, like the entire story, or something minor, like some very specific scenario. As long as it has a significant impact on the enjoyment of the game, it qualifies. Do keep in mind, for the games that have been remade, I'm only gonna consider things that apply to the most recent release. So, things that have since been fixed about the originals don't count. We begin at Shadow Dragon, of course, which is exactly a prime example of a game that had a ton of stuff fixed in the remake for DS. The many repeating portraits, gone. The poor graphics, wouldn't say fixed, but it's at least an improvement. A lot of quality of life fixes have been introduced in the remake, making the journey through Arcania a lot less tedious and slow. Supports weren't added, however, which is a huge shame and results in a ton of characters barely having any character in the first place. Too many of your units get a few lines when they're first recruited, and that's about it for the entire game. And yet, it still isn't the worst part of the game. That questionable honor goes to the way you recruit the newly added characters. You can only get your hands on Norn, Athena, Horus, Ymir and Etzel by killing off your own units. Yeah, the paralogue where you can recruit these characters can only be unlocked by having very few units left in your army at the end of certain chapters. Not only does this literally go straight against the point of the game, keeping your units alive, it's also very difficult to do while playing blind. The number you're allowed to have is so low that I sincerely doubt there are people who qualified for it through normally playing the game. You really have to send your units to their doom by the dozens in order to access these paralogs. It's truly a bizarre idea that should have never left the drawing board. We continue with Gaiden, or rather Shadows of Valentia, which fixed a ton of problems of the original game, making my job a tad trickier. However, I wanna say fortunately, but this is not a good thing, they didn't really touch the map design. And as loyal viewers of my channel will know, I am a legit hater of Valentia's map design. Not only are they incredibly small, to the point they almost feel like a mobile game at times, they also appear to be on a mission to be as annoying as they possibly can be. There are so many layouts that appear to be designed for the sake of being tedious, and especially Celica's maps are also filled to the brim with the most annoying enemies Fire Emblem has ever seen. There are several stages in the game where it legit feels like retreat abuse, where you start the map over again but now without the enemies you previously defeated, was the intended strategy, and that is unacceptable. Valentia has the worst maps in Fire Emblem history, I have no doubt in my mind about that. Onto Mystery of the Emblem, which also received a remake on the DS that didn't only add a ton of stuff to the original game, but also fixed mistakes from Shadow Dragon's remake. There are now supports and support-like talk moments, adding a ton of character to your units, which you also no longer have to sacrifice in order to recruit the new faces. What wasn't changed, however, were the graphics, and while I could excuse that for Shadow Dragon, I can't for new Mystery of the Emblem. Come on, IS, you had ample time to fix this pseudo 3D look and go for full-on sprites. You're not seriously gonna tell me you thought this looked good. That said, I do think it reflects well on the game that this is the worst thing about it. I think it might be one of the most overlooked Fire Emblem games, but it's actually really good. If you enjoy the GBA titles and have never played it, you should definitely give it a shot. Anyway, that's enough positivity, time to talk about the worst things about the Jug Draw games. For Genealogy of the Holy War, we are once again looking at map designs. This time though, we are dealing with the exact opposite problem. FE4's maps are way too big. While I do like that vision and philosophy more than small maps, the execution is simply not good. It results in incredibly slow and tedious play sessions, with sometimes even backtracking, which should never be a thing in Fire Emblem games. It also immediately kills any class that isn't mounted, because they simply take way too long to cross these enormous areas, it's not worth it. With the remake eyes of course being on Genealogy of the Holy War currently, IS really need to figure out a way around this for the remake, because I can't see the many new Fire Emblem fans who have joined the train in recent years enjoy chapters this huge. For Thracia, we're instead gonna zoom in on something very specific. Something that could possibly happen, it very well might not, but it's insane it's even possible. While most Fire Emblem games make sure that if doors are mandatory to be opened, you can always get yourself a key or a thief to do so. But Thracia actually does not. If you lose your thief to one of the many long-range attackers or ambush spawns, you are often just completely out of luck. There are several chapters in the late game of Thracia where you can get straight up soft locked if you lose your thief or are out of door keys, forcing you to either restart the chapter or even worse, restart the entire game. I guess at least IS learned from this and made sure it never happened again, but frankly it's insane it's even possible in the first place. Next up is Binding Blade, where in my opinion easily the worst thing is this guy. Roy, son of Eliwood and Ninian if you ask me, slayer of absolutely nothing, maybe a few bandits if you're lucky. Never before or after has a lord, the main character, the one you have to field, been so useless. Now, I have seen some people argue this is part of the game design, that guiding this weak pawn to the throne to end chapters is the entire challenge of Binding Blade. To which I say, fair enough. You may be right, it may be the intention. But ask yourself, is that really fun? Is it fun to be forced to use a unit who just flat out isn't good, and also doesn't promote and become good until the game is basically done? I would argue it isn't. At least we weren't forced to use Lyn anymore after her own little story. And speak of the devil, Blazing Blade is next, where I honestly struggled a ton to think of anything. This title is simply really solid. And while I do think its highs are not as high as some other games, it doesn't have many lows either. In fact, that sentence kinda applies to like the next 5 games or so. Intelligent systems really hit a hot streak here. Anyway, I would say the worst thing about Blazing Blade is the way the game handles Eliwood and Hector's stories. I've never really understood why this game needed 3 stories. Lyn's I can understand. It may not be too much fun on repeat playthroughs, but at least it's its own thing. Hector and Eliwood's stories are almost identical, save for a few chapters here and there, that add a ton of story and world building, but little in terms of actual content. If you ask me, the stories could have easily been combined into one big story. The way the final product does it feels like unnecessary padding. Onto Sacred Stones, which, remember, is one of those games without obvious low points in my opinion. So I had to really look at the game with a critical eye to find the worst thing about it. And after some consideration, I think I'd consider the difficulty Sacred Stones' biggest issue. It's simply a tad too easy. If this had been the first Fire Emblem game here in the West, I could kinda understand it, but seeing as it's the second and doesn't even feature a tutorial or anything, I don't really get why it's such a cakewalk. And what makes it even stranger is how much of a whiplash, difficulty-wise, Ephraim's pirate ship map is. This is genuinely one of the hardest Fire Emblem chapters on the GBA, so for it to come in what's regarded as by far the easiest game is very strange. Next up are the Radiant games, which are again very solid. For Path of Radiance, I would say its presentation is probably its biggest flaw. After the GBA games, which had stellar sprite work and was clearly a console IS was very comfortable with, Ike's first outing does feel a little bit more rough, with not exactly the greatest graphics and just a flat out slow and somewhat tedious gameplay experience. It's not enough to stop it from being one of the series' best, but I would consider it the worst thing about the game. Radiant Dawn looks a whole lot better thanks to the magic power of the Wii, so I have to look for something different here. And that honestly isn't easy cause this game is amazing, but my vote goes to the lack of supports. Now, Radiant Dawn does have base camp conversations, which help patch up the wounds a little, but it's not the same. It leaves especially the newly introduced characters feeling underdeveloped, which is a shame, it could have been easily avoided. Onto the 3DS now for Awakening, the final title of what I consider the hot streak of games without glaring flaws. But we have to name something, which for this series-saving title is gonna be Reinforcements. I have always hated reinforcements who can act on the same turn they show up. It's such an unfair game mechanic that you can't possibly prepare for, and for some reason they feel more annoying in Awakening than ever. Maybe it's because there is an above average amount of flying enemies? I haven't done the math, but it feels that way at least. It's not something game breaking, nothing you put the game down over, but it's unnecessarily tedious. Next is Fates. Oh, Fates. I think we all know what the worst part of this game is, right? You can easily find several hour-long video essays that will explain better than I ever could what is wrong with the story of this game, but it is an absolute dumpster fire. There are plenty of great games in the series with simple but perfectly fun stories, but Fates shoots for the moon and lands at the bottom of the ocean. It's so messy, So awkward, so weird, so unnecessary. The fact that there are 3 chances here to make the story work and none deliver is genuinely insane. It's easily the worst thing about Fates in my opinion. Following Fates, we got a bunch of spin-off titles, and I don't see why they shouldn't be included in this video, so they're up next. I'll keep it short though, the worst parts are pretty obvious in my opinion. For Tokyo Mirage Sessions, I'd say it's the way the game uses Fire Emblem. This doesn't feel like a full-on crossover in my opinion. It's more of a Shin Megami Tensei game with Fire Emblem characters as mirages, that's about it. Still cool, don't get me wrong, but as someone coming into the game from the Fire Emblem side, it's a bit of a disappointment in that regard. For Heroes, easily the worst part of the game is the absolutely criminal price of the Feh Pass. Now, I get this is a gacha game and those don't tend to be too kind for their players' wallets, but I honestly think Heroes does a pretty good job of entertaining even free-to-play players. With the Feh Pass, this is just wrong. Nearly $10 a month, and it's even worse here in Europe. It's 12 euros I think. Honestly, unacceptable, but will's gonna will. For Fire Emblem Warriors, the answer is clear as well. The roster. This should have been a celebration of the series, but instead it became a celebration of Awakening and Fates. It's such a shame. I mean, Ike isn't even playable in this game, and he's like one of the most popular Fire Emblem characters out there. Such a huge missed opportunity. I really hope we one day get a new Fire Emblem Warriors game that does understand the assignment. Back to the main series now with Three Houses. While it is in my opinion the best Fire Emblem game, I actually wouldn't say it's without obvious flaws whatsoever. I just think the highs are at a level the rest of the games have never hit. Probably the biggest of those obvious flaws is how the game clearly wants you to play multiple routes, in order to see everything it has to offer, but then also makes a lot of design decisions that suggest they only expect you to play one. Why is there no option to skip or at least speed up the academy phase of the game, if it's identical between all routes anyway? Why are so many maps reused between routes if you expect players to play them all? And then I haven't even mentioned how similar in general Silver Snow and Verdant Wind are. All these things are nothing unacceptable, but it is a shame because with everything Three Houses does right, if it had fixed those remaining flaws, it could have ended discussions over what game is the best in the series entirely. But of course it still did exceptionally well, so much so that it received its own spin-off, Three Hopes. This is honestly a great game. It's incredible how much this game feels like a Fire Emblem game while not technically being one. I sometimes genuinely forget it's not a main series game. It does make some weird story decisions though in every route, with probably the treatment of Edelgard in the Blue Lion's path being the most disappointing in my opinion. But I would say the worst thing about the game is something more specific. It's the way you unlock the true ending. In order to do so, you need to recruit Byleth when you have the chance, which sounds perfectly doable and isn't hard or anything, but the problem is there is basically no way to know you should do this when playing blind. Throughout the game, Byleth has been your main rival. Arval is constantly in your ear telling you to kill them, and it's literally one of the chapter's missions to do so. But if you do, then you get the bad ending and miss out on the final few chapters and any meaningful resolve for the story. So what the game wants you to do is ignore all these warnings and orders and end the chapter without engaging Byleth at all. It's so incredibly counterintuitive, which is okay if the reward is some hidden Easter egg, but this is just flat out a rewarding ending of the game at stakes here. To put that behind such an unclear objective is simply bad game design. And finally, we have Fire Emblem Engage. Now, I'm not exactly being controversial when I say this game's story, just like Fates, isn't exactly the best in the series. And especially after Three Houses, that has given the fanbase quite the whiplash. However, personally, I don't think it was so terrible. It's far from great, but I would compare it more with the simpler stories of the GBA games than I would with Fates. Like I mentioned before, Fates went for grand. Engage did not, I would say, even if their botched attempts at emotional moments was a little awkward to watch. No, I would say the truly worst part of Engage is something way more niche. Skirmishes. These are genuinely the most useless thing in Fire Emblem ever. What is the point of a skirmish? To train up your weaker units and allow them to join the main army. So then, what mustn't skirmishes be? infuriatingly difficult. But that is exactly what happened here. For some reason, skirmishes scale to the level of a Leer, who is most likely your best unit, meaning they are probably gonna be some of the most difficult chapters in the entire game, no matter when you try them out. Even for your main team, they will be a bit of a challenge, but stragglers will just flat out not survive a run-in with these corrupted, meaning the sole purpose of skirmishes is lost. Unbelievable, really. And with that, we have covered the worst part of every Fire Emblem game. What do you consider the worst things about our favorite games? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.